All right, we are continuing on with Mark. We're at the last portion of Mark. Last Sunday, we celebrated Mother's Day, but the week before that, we talked about the betrayal of Judas, the plan in his betrayal. We talked about Passover, how he instituted the communion by transforming the Passover meal into what, again, we now call communion. And after that, Peter's denial was predicted, and one of the last things we were talking about, when Jesus was praying, and we see this in Luke where he says, Simon, Simon, Satan desires to sift you as wheat, but I have prayed for you, and when you're encouraged, go back and get your brothers and encourage them. So now we're just still on that same night. It's just after midnight. I try to put a little bit of a timeline on this after last week's question and comment. So we'll see a slide in there. We'll try to get a better timeline of where we're at. But today we're going to look at the arrested, tried, and denied. So we're going to look at four things here: the Garden of Gethsemane, Judas's betrayal and Jesus' arrest, Jesus faces the Sanhedrin, and Peter's denial. So with that, we'll look at this. Kind of give us a better timeline. We started off in Sunday with Palm Sunday in his triumphal entry, and I gave some, I forgot to color that in, gave some scriptures that we can go back and verify. So when the slides are up on the site, you can go back and look through this. But we've made it from Sunday all the way till Thursday. Remember, this is the, oh, you know what? I think I got the days. Oh, no. Yeah, that's correct. Well, no, I may have got the dates wrong, because we're actually going to be looking at the 15th. Yes. So this is supposed to be 14th, and at the end it's the 15th. So the night of that is already the 15th where we're going to pick up at. Because again, Friday is when he's got to be crucified. And I'm also going to put a little bit of timestamps on some of these things. So when we read about, we talked about the rooster crowing, that is going to be around 3 a.m. That's what we talked about last time. We set up the whole scenario of what the timeline looks like. So that's about 3 a.m. So this is just after Passover. They're going into the garden, and that's where we're going to pick up. So again, here is where they would have celebrated the Last Supper in the upper room. And after that, they go out. And during that whole time, John chapter 13 through 17 is going on. That whole discourse of the Holy Spirit, of things that are going to come. He's still talking to his disciples up until they get to the Garden of Gethsemane here. And so, again, we were previous on the Mount of Olives. Now we were here at the Last Supper, upper room. And now we're going to the garden, and that's where we're going to pick up. Real quick, I was just looking and Googling some pictures of what that garden might have looked like. And so that's one picture of it. Right at the foot of the Mount of Olives and right beyond the Kidron River. And so as I was getting into this word study, Gethsemane, in Hebrew, it's Gat Sheman, which means press oil. Gethsemane in Greek is an oil press, the name of a place at the foot of Mount of Olives beyond the torrent Kidron. So another word I want to look at is, that word's going to kind of come up a little later, is adimeneo, to be troubled, great, distressed, or anguished, depressed, to be in distress of mind, be full of heaviness, or be very heavy. So the interesting thing about the Garden of Gethsemane, I thought that was really cool when I was reading all this and putting these things together, is the place that he went, called the Garden of Gethsemane, was where they would actually they would have olive groves. They would pick these olives anywhere between, in the fall, October through September. They would go and they'd pick these olives, and they would get it into they'd get a mill and they'd begin to crush these olives. The olives were really hard on the outside, so they would actually have a donkey on the other end of this pole, kind of moving it around, crushing the olives there. And once the olives were crushed, they would gather them in these baskets and they would put it in the pockets, and they would probably gather maybe 10, maybe more, and they would start to press the oil out, and that's what that looks like. So these are the baskets here, and there's a big rock or a weight on it with another pole or a piece of a tree, and they would begin to press down, and on the other end of that are stones that were tied to it for more weight. So the way this would work is they would pick their olives, put them in the millstone area, and they'd crush them, then they'd get them, put them in the press. Now, the first time they would press these, that was called virgin oil. That oil was used in the temples to light the candles, specifically the menorah, and for the priestly use. The second press they would do, that would be used for medicines or to make food with, makeup, things like that you would be able to use. The third press, the oil would be, just not that great. So they would actually use that to light lamps and other things. So I thought that was interesting to look at as we followed Jesus to the Garden of Gethsemane, the oil press, and how 3 times these things had to be pressed out. And so we're going to pick up right there. We're going to do as we usually do. We'll read the 10 verses and then we'll begin to walk through them. So in Mark chapter 14, we're going to pick up in verse 32 and read through 42. Then they came to a place which was named Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." And he took Peter, James, and John with him, and began to be troubled and deeply distressed. Then he said to them, "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch." He went a little further and fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but what you will." Then he came and found them sleeping and said to Peter, "Simon, are you sleeping? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray, lest you enter in temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Again he went away and prayed and spoke the same words. And he returned. He found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. Then he came the third time and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? It is enough. The hour has come. Behold, the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." Amen. So now we can kind of see the 3 presses and the 3 prayers. He's going in, he's under the pressure, intense pressure of what he's about to go through. And he's going and he's praying and he's anguished. And he says, even to death. So Jesus, after the Passover meal, led his disciples into a familiar place in the garden to pray. Again, we read this in John 8, 1 and 2. Even Judas was familiar with this place. So that's how he knew where they were going to be after the Passover. So Jesus takes his inner circle with him further into the garden to pray and reveals his terror and sorrow and instructs the 3 to watch. Jesus prays 3 times using the same verbiage, "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but what you will." That's in Mark 14:36. And an angel appeared from heaven to strengthen him, and he sweat blood. That's in Luke 22:43 through 44. Now, as I was going through this, I tried to put together maybe the 3 times that he was praying. So the first one I got we'll see in Mark 14:35 through 36, and also in Matthew 26 and 36, and in Luke 22:40 through 41. The second time is Matthew 26:42 through 43, also in Mark 14:39, and Luke 22 and 44. And the third prayer is going to be in Mark 14:41, 42, Matthew 26:44 through 46, and Luke 22:45 through 46. Now, I tried to space this out to figure out when exactly the angel came and when exactly he was sweating blood. I couldn't really pin that down, so I put it down as the second part, because I'm sure when he first went in there and began to pray, he already knew what was about to happen. He began to pray. And the second time, I believe that's when the angel came, began to empower him. And it could be the third time when the blood came, when that real hard squeeze of the olive press would come to get the rest of what was going on out of there. So I just want to have that in our minds in the background, that this is the place, the Messiah, the anointed one. And what do you anoint people with in the Bible? Olive oil. So the Messiah, the anointed one, is here praying fervently in the garden 3 times just to match up exactly what we know about the Jewish tradition in the Garden of Gethsemane. And so Jesus was not conflicted about the Father's will because he's praying, Father, all things are possible. If it's your will, let this pass. So Jesus was not conflicted about the Father's will. Rather, it was his humanity expressing itself by shrieking back from the fury of God's wrath over sin, Satan, and the power of death and guilt of iniquity. So he wasn't saying, I don't want to do this. He was saying, if there's another way, Father, I like the way my brother says it. If there's a plan B, let's do plan B. Is it possible that and all things are possible. And Jesus, knowing God is omnipotent, omniscient, and able, could design an alternate plan for salvation. But again, he wasn't shrinking back from the cross. But again, he knew that this cup he was about to take was God's full wrath on these things, and that God was going to turn away from them. And he was going to have to bear the burden of the world's sin upon him. And so Jesus displays no conflict in doing the Father's will. He surrendered and shows total commitment in the following through and willingly takes on the cup of wrath. In John 6:38, it says, "For I have come down from heaven not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me." So he wasn't troubled of I don't want to do this, Father. I don't want to do your will. He was just saying, Father, if there's another way, please open up that door and I will walk that way. But again, he was obedient and he was loving and he came to do the Father's will. There was no other way out of this. And so he submitted willingly to the Father's will to take that cup on. And that cup consisted of the betrayal as well. Remember, before he got there, he was telling the disciples, the hour's come where I'm going to be betrayed and I'm going to be beaten and I'm going to be crucified. So all this, the cup is being poured and now he's reaching for the cup, so to say. In these next couple of verses, Jesus, during his 3 prayers, would check on his disciples and tell them to watch and pray, lest they fall into temptation, only to find them sleeping each time. And in their case, remember, they had just finished a huge Passover meal. They've had their cups of wine. And so they're out and they're trying to stay up with Christ. And he keeps having to go back. And I think that's a really nice picture as Jesus is going and he's fervently praying and he knows what he's about to do, that he takes the time, I got to go check on my sheep. And he goes and he checks on them. Get up, guys. What are you doing? 1 hour? So this lets us know that Jesus was praying for an hour already. And he comes back. So the timeline is shortly after midnight. And all this has got to take place within these hours, because at 9 a.m. he's going to be crucified. So this is going on. He's checking on his disciples. He's going back. And Jesus warns and teaches his disciples that although and when he says the flesh is weak, but the spirit is willing, Jesus warns and teaches his disciples that although the willing spirit desires to be obedient, it is attached to the weak and unredeemed flesh and makes it difficult to practice the righteousness desired. We read that in Romans 7:15 through 23 when Paul talks about the things that he wants to do, he doesn't do, and he finds himself doing the things that he hates. And so it's not that they are not able to do it. It's again, they're in this unredeemed flesh just like we all are. So that's our battle a lot of times, as we want to do the Father's will, but this unredeemed flesh begins to cry out and attack us. And so it just depends on where we fall in that. Do we deny ourselves or do we give in? So that's what he was making the statement about there. Just that difficult to practice righteousness desired because we're in this flesh. And then Jesus awakens his disciples a final time, asleep from their sorrow is what Luke says, 22:45. So we'll stop right there. Again, Jesus was also very sorrowful, but he didn't fall asleep. We, again, humans in this unredeemed flesh, sometimes, and I've been guilty of it, I've had to sit and think about this, where you have so many things going on in your life that you're just like, I just want to go to sleep to forget about this stuff. I just want, and so the emotional strain that they're going through and the things that Jesus has been telling them, especially if you read John 13 through 17, where he's like, I'm going to leave you guys, and where I go, you cannot go. They're all trying to handle this and process this, and it's so much that they're just so sorrowful. They're just like, I just want to go to sleep. I just want to forget about this for a little bit, and I just want to lay down and not have to think about this. That's what they were kind of going through. Again, not only that, but they ate a full meal, and their sorrow. And again, Luke tells us that because they were asleep because of their sorrow. to alert them of the coming betrayer. So he's waking them up to alert them of the coming betrayer. And Jesus, after awaking and alerting his disciples, does not retreat from the coming conflict, but confronts it. So this is another thing that we can learn from Jesus. You know, when we are faced with something we have to deal with, a conflict, a situation that's uncomfortable, we don't retreat. We have to begin to take steps forward and get out of that comfort zone. You know, no matter what the conflict is, we go in it in prayer and pray, just in the will of the Father, praying that he's with us, praying that these things shall unfold the way he desires, and we head towards that conflict. We do not retreat. We remain firm in our faith, and we stand and we speak truth. This is what Jesus is teaching his disciples. He didn't say, hey, get up, guys. They're coming. Let's go this way. Nope. He says, all right, here they come. Let's go. And so Jesus walks with his disciples to confront the conflict. One more quick word study as we get into the betrayal. The word here for sword is going to be makaria. And it's a large knife used for killing animals and cutting up flesh, ancient Greek bladed weapon and a tool similar in appearance to the modern day machete. So that's what that is here. I couldn't get a really big picture of it, but this is an old ancient one they would be using, maybe 18 inches, 20 at the most. So that's what they would be holding on to. And then another word I wanted to look at was spira, a military cohort, about 600 men, legionaries. And so we'll read verses 43 through 50, and we'll break that down. And here we're talking about Judas's betrayal. And immediately, while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, with a great multitude, with swords and clubs, came from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Now his betrayer had given them a signal, saying, whomever I kiss, he is the one. Seize him and lead him away safely. And as soon as he had come, immediately he went up to him and said to him, Rabbi, Rabbi, and kissed him. Then they laid their hands on him and took him. And one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Then Jesus answered and said to them, have you come out against a robber with swords and clubs to take me? I was daily with you in the temple teaching you, and you did not seize me, but the scripture must be fulfilled. Then they all forsook him and fled. And we'll stop there. We'll deal with these other two verses. I'll deal with these last couple of verses while we go through it. So again, Judas's betrayal is what we're going to look at, 43 through 45. Again, remember, he wakes up his disciples. Here they come. Jesus was still speaking when Judas, one of the 12, was in view with a detachment of troops and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees. So that word spira, we read in John 18:3, that is a detachment of troops. That means he had a large group, up to 600 men. Now, I don't know if there were exactly 600 men, but there were Roman soldiers. That means they had to go to Pilate to get these men, be like, hey, this is, we found someone who's going up against Rome. We need to go get this guy before he starts creating an uncivil arrest. So they are able to get these troops along, it says, with swords and clubs. The Roman soldiers would have been carrying the swords. Clubs, I don't know if I have that in there. Okay, yeah. I'll just read that part. Jesus was still speaking with detachment of troops and officers from chief priests with swords, clubs, torches, and lanterns. So again, Roman soldiers would have been holding the swords. The clubs would have been from the officers from the temple. So he had those, the Roman soldiers. He had officers from the temple, and not only that, but we know that someone's servant was there. We find that out in John, that Malchus was a servant of Caiaphas. So I don't know why he was there. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't an officer, but he was sent along the way with them. So there was a huge crowd coming to arrest Jesus at night. So Jesus, greeted by Judas, calling him Rabbi, and with a common, this was a common sign of homage, of respect and affection, a kiss on the cheek. This was the prearranged signal to identify Jesus and arrest him. So back then, you wouldn't only be able to kiss the cheek, but the hand. You could sometimes kiss the garment of someone, and this was showing a sign of respect. And so Judas approaches him that way, and I was reading, Judas never calls Jesus Lord. We can look in the scriptures. He never calls him Lord. He calls him Rabbi. And so we can already see that there's no trust in Christ. He doesn't look at Jesus as the Messiah, because we've seen John do it. We've seen Peter do it. We've seen some of the disciples do it, but Judas never calls him Lord. He never addresses him that way, only as a teacher. So we can already begin to discern that Judas is not a believer. Not fully yet. It just hasn't clicked with him yet. He's not the guy that he was waiting for that was going to overthrow Rome. Jesus was on a kingdom agenda, and Judas was on a worldly agenda. And so again, he kisses him. He shows that sign of respect. And remember, this was like, hey, when I do this to him, this is the guy. Why that? Because Jesus was an ordinary person. You know, we read in Isaiah, he had no beauty, nothing that we could go after him. And so he didn't say, hey, the one we come up to him, he's going to have a glow, a halo around his head. Nothing like that. We see that in pictures. So he's such an ordinary person that he doesn't really stand out, that he has to tell him, when I go up to the person and kiss them on the cheek, that's the one. Seize him and arrest him and take him away. And so that's exactly what Judas does. He goes in, he hails him, Rabbi, Rabbi, kisses him on the cheek. And remember Jesus, he's like, Judas, you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? And after this had happened, Judas doesn't just walk away. Judas is going to step back with the crowd. And he's with the Roman soldiers, and he's with the temple officers and the servants. And so Jesus' arrest happens in verses 46 through 50. And Jesus, knowing all things that would come upon him, stepped forward and said to them, who are you seeking? And this is in John 18:4. Let me step on this side. Who are you seeking? And revealed to them that they had no authority to take his disciples and demand them to let the disciples go their way. And that's in John 18:8 and 9. So the authority that I'm talking about, that I didn't put in there, is whenever Jesus comes to these people, and Judas had just kissed him on the cheek, and Judas gets back with his people, he says, who are you looking for? And they say, Jesus of Nazareth. And he says, I am he. And they fall back. This word in Greek is ego emai. I think I'm saying that right. And it's the tetragrammaton of Yahweh. They weren't able to really say God's name, so they would say Yahweh or the Lord. And so this was the living word speaking the written word. So this was showing his deity, so that when they came and approached him, who are you looking for? Jesus of Nazareth, I am he. So powerful that these men fell back, including Judas. And they got back up again, and he asked him again, who are you looking for? Jesus of Nazareth, I am he. So this is showing his authority. And why he's doing this is to really show, like, you're looking for me, let the rest of these guys go. And if you read John, you'll see that in there. And so Jesus gets placed in custody, and the disciples take notice and ask, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? And this is in Luke 22:49. You gotta really look at the synoptics to put this all together. So again, he's there. He asks them twice. They fall. They get back up. And as soon as they lay their hands on Jesus, that's when the disciples and I'm sure it was Peter. It doesn't say, but I can almost imagine that it's Peter. Lord, shall we strike him with the sword? So let's pause right there. Where did they get this sword? Because remember, that's not how you advance a kingdom. That's not how we advance Christianity, through violence. You know, Islam may do that, or other religions may do that, but we advance it by sharing the gospel one person at a time. So he wasn't saying get up, rise, and attack. So the sword's going to come into play in Luke. And that's going to be in Luke 22. And this is right after Peter's denial, when Jesus was like, Simon, Simon, Satan has desired to sift you as wheat. And after that, Jesus goes and tells him in Luke 22:35 through 38 to gather the supplies for the road. Because remember, previously, he's like, don't take a knapsack, don't take an extra walking stick, don't take a money bag. Now it's different. In verse 36 in Luke 22 says, but now let him who has a money bag, let him take it. And likewise a knapsack, and he who has no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one. Verse 38, they say, Lord, look, here are 2 swords. And he said to them, it is enough. Again, things are changing. Jesus is about to go, and he knows it. Now they're going to be out there with the Holy Spirit, but they're going to have to protect themselves. And he's not saying that you're going to have to go into battle and this is how you're going to advance the kingdom, but he was just getting them to protect themselves. So that comes into play. There's a oh man, there's a word for it. It's a principle. Like whenever you see a movie, in the beginning of the movie, when you see a gun in the beginning opening scenes, later on that gun's going to come into play later. So here we're already talking about a sword. Later on, this sword's going to come into play later. And so Jesus teaches, well, let me get back here. So Jesus, knowing all things that would come upon him, stepped forward and said to them, "Who are you seeking?" Revealed to them that they had no authority to take his disciples and demanded them to let their disciples go their way. Jesus gets placed into custody and the disciples take notice and ask, "Lord, shall we strike with the sword?" Jesus teaches a restatement of the principle in Genesis 9:6. And I'm going to pull that up because I forgot to write that down. But Genesis 9:6 says, "Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed, for in the image of God he made man." So he's kind of restating this here. And he's affirming that capital punishment is suitable punishment for murder after Peter, and this is after Peter cuts off Malchus's ear. And then he tells them to permit even this in Luke 22:51. "Shall I not drink the cup which my Father has given me?" And they all forsook him and fled. So in this scene, and I think The Passion of Christ, we've seen that movie, I think it paints it so well. You know, he's there, he's getting arrested, and now the disciples are getting up. They only have 2 swords. We already know Peter had one of them, and if not the second. He gets up, and Peter is not aiming for the ear. Remember this 19-inch sword. Peter, before he's denial, "I will die with you. I'll even go to prison for you. I am down for you, Jesus." So Peter's not, he's a fisherman. His aim's not well. And so he's not just like, okay, I'm going to just cut the ear. If he's aiming at this and he hit that, he was probably aiming towards the head. I'm thinking neck. I don't want to put anything out there. But he gets him and he slices his ear off. And that's when Jesus goes and puts that ear back on Malchus. This was actually the only recorded fresh wound miracle that Jesus does. Other miracles, it's illnesses and diseases, but this was a fresh wound, and he does it. And still, these people don't stop and think, maybe we shouldn't be arresting this guy. He said some words, we fell back. He just picked up his enemy's ear, put it on his head, but they still proceed, and they begin to take him into custody. And then that part where it says, "Permit even this." The disciples are still probably struggling. He's like, hey, let this happen. He knows this is part of the Father's will. This has got to carry on forward because they're trying to stop him going to the cross. Remember, we've seen this when he was being tempted by Satan, when he was trying to get him to step out of his humility. You don't need to do that. Jump down from there. They'll all see you and they're going to know who you are. That way he can go around the cross. And again, if the cross didn't happen, no salvation. So and again, we got to make sure that we know that the enemy is at play here also. Judas is already doing his thing. And now it's unfolding. These events are happening. And so again, just as it was written, he knew what was going to happen. They all fled. They all forsook him and they fled. And that's Mark 50. So I'll deal with 51 and through 52. It says that in Mark, a certain young man followed him, having a linen cloth thrown around his naked body. And the young man laid hold of him and he left the linen cloth and fled. Scholars believe that that's Mark. I don't want to bring up too much because that's just what, after reading and studying, they believe that was Mark. They also believe that the house that the upper room was Mark's mom's house in Jerusalem. And that's how they kind of knew where Jesus would be. So Mark kind of followed behind. I'm not going to get too much into it. That's just what scholars believe. And it's just, no other gospels have that in there, but that's what they believe, that naked person fleeing was Mark. And now we'll get on to the next one. Now I didn't get that all, did I? We'll go on to the next one here. Jesus faces the Sanhedrin. So now he's been arrested, and now he's moving forth. And we're going to look at 43 to 65. Or 53 to 65. "And they led Jesus away to the high priest, and with him were assembled all the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes." This is the Sanhedrin. "But Peter followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he sat with the servants and warmed himself at the fire. Now the chief priests and all the council sought testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but found none. For many bore false witnesses against him, but their testimonies did not agree." Then some rose up and bore false witnesses against him, saying, "We heard him say, I will destroy the temple made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands." But not even then did their testimony agree. And then the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, saying, "Do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you?" But he kept silent and said nothing. Again the high priest asked him, saying to him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" Jesus said, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "What further need do we have of witnesses? You have heard it, the blasphemy. What do you think?" And they all condemned him to be deserving of death. Then some began to spit on him and blindfold him and to beat him and to say to him, "Prophesy." And the officers struck him with the palms of their hands. So now he's being led away. He's from the garden to be tried. Now we know through the gospel accounts, specifically John, that he didn't go straight to Caiaphas. He went to Annas. Jesus is led away to be tried by Annas first, the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest, and Caiaphas was the high priest that prophesied that one man should die for all the people. Peter and another disciple followed at a distance. Annas was previously a high priest 20 some years before, and he got removed when Rome was doing their thing, and they removed him and put another person. That other person was his son. 5 times this happened, and then now we're at his son-in-law. So this wasn't a legit thing. They were, and I was talking to my brother before this was like the Jewish mob. They had mob bosses, and they were like, "Hey, we're running this thing. This is how we do it. We're keeping it in the family. If this one's not a high priest, then your brother and this person, it's all just a big conspiracy to keep themselves into power." And so they go to Annas first, who's not even a legitimate high priest. And Jesus is dishonestly interrogated by Annas about his disciples and his doctrine. He's like, "Okay, tell me about what you've been doing, your disciples, your doctrine." And this is in John 18:19. And the motive was always to destroy Jesus. We read this back far in Mark 3:6. Remember when Jesus was first starting his ministry, he was healing and he didn't have no pushback until he started doing works on the Sabbath. And when they seen him heal a man on the Sabbath, they were like, "We got to destroy this guy. We've got to get rid of this guy." So even back then, they had to get rid of him. And they knew the motive. They didn't want a fair trial. They knew what they wanted to do with him. So Jesus responds to Annas as an appeal to a fair trial by telling Annas to call on a witness about these things he taught openly, and to respond. And his response was a strike on the face by an officer. We read that in 18:20 and 23. So real quick, with Annas first, the whole religious trial was unjustified. There was no crime, no witnesses. It was in the middle of the night, and there was it was pretty much a soft trial. No court, no judges, no legal authority, no persecutors, no defenders. It was a perversion of justice. This is what was going on, and this was all going against their law. We read Deuteronomy 16. I was looking and I was like, surely they know the law. They should have known this stuff. In Deuteronomy 16, 18 through 20. Get it right here. Yeah. Says, and this is about justice must be administered. "You shall appoint judges and officers in all your gates, which the Lord your God gives you, according to your tribes, and they shall judge the people with the judgment. You shall not pervert justice. You shall not show partiality, nor take a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and twists the words of the righteous. You shall follow what is altogether just, that you may live and inherit the land which the Lord your God is giving you." And again in chapter 19, verses 15 through 21. "One witness shall not rise against a man concerning any iniquity or any sin that he commits. By the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses the matter shall be established. If a false witnesses rise against a man to testify against him of wrongdoing, then both men in the controversy shall stand before the Lord, before the priests and the judges who serve in those days, and the judges shall make careful inquiry. And indeed, if the witness is a false witness who has testified falsely against his brother, then you shall do to him as he thought to have done to his brother. So you shall put away the evil from among you. And those who remain shall hear and fear, and hereafter they shall not again commit such evil among you. So he's saying if these false witnesses are known to be false and they're claiming this guy to be a murderer, but he's not a murderer, well, that judgment that was going to be on them has got to be placed on the false witnesses. So again, this is all Old Testament. They know this stuff. So Jesus, again, is dishonestly interrogated by Annas, the high priest, or Annas about his disciples and doctrine. The motive was always to destroy Jesus. Again, Jesus responds to Annas as an appeal to a fair trial. He's like, you've heard me. People have heard me. I was in the temple openly teaching. Why are you asking me? He wants him to self-incriminate himself before there's even something to charge him with. And so Jesus is basically saying, let's do this thing right. Call some witnesses. And they scramble around trying to find witnesses, and they can't do it. And then when they do it, their testimony doesn't match up. So now he's going to Caiaphas. And Jesus is bound to Caiaphas, the high priest, for further interrogation where he would remain silent. Isaiah 53:7 says this. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and the sheep before his shearers is silent. And he would not say a word. And by him being silent, it made them look more guilty because they're scrambling around like, okay, you say this and you say that. And again, their testimonies were not matching up. So Jesus faced the Sanhedrin as they attempted to round up witnesses to give false testimony, but could not find a charge that had enough credibility to indict him because the testimonies did not agree. Jesus' figurative statement, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it up, was taken out of context and still not enough from the two witnesses that were round up. Because they were saying, and they may have heard him on the way out of the temple when he was talking to his disciples. He's like, no stone will be on top of another. This thing's going to be destroyed. And so they got that and they're like, oh, who do you think you are? You're going to build this up with no hands? Or you're saying you're God? And they kept pushing and pressing. He wouldn't say a word. So Jesus remained silent until confronted by Caiaphas about his identity in verse 61. And that's whenever he gives that confession. Jesus gives a true confession of his deity. And is taken from Psalm 110 and Daniel 7:13. And I'll read that. Because he didn't ask him, okay, what is it they're trying to say you did? He didn't say that. He says, are you the Son of God? He was already trying to get him there. And so Psalm 110 says, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make my enemies a footstool. Daniel 7:13 says, I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days and brought him near before him. So Jesus is getting the scripture and just quoting it right back. And at that point, Caiaphas, the high priest, he rips his garment. That was a sign of grief in the Old Testament. And it was also against the law in the Old Testament, Leviticus 10:6 and 21:10. This, if you were a high priest and you did that, the charge was death. But that didn't happen there. In the Talmud, the oral teaching says that if it's the only consideration is if it was blasphemy, then a high priest can do that. So he did, and I don't think Caiaphas was grieved. I think he was more like, we finally got him. He was excited, ripped his clothes, and then they blindfolded, mocked, and beat Jesus. This is the last portion here. During the background of all this, Peter's already denied him. And so we'll look at this here. Jesus' prophetic prediction of Peter's denial began at the first trial with Annas as he was standing at the door at a distance. In the courtyard, a servant girl looked at him intently, is what Luke 22:5-6 is. So they're warming up and he's by the door and she's looking at him like, I've seen you before. I know you. You look familiar. And then asked him if he was one of the disciples, to which he replied, I am not. I'm not this person. I don't even know this guy. Peter denies Jesus a second time when he's confronted by another servant girl and denied Jesus with an oath. An oath is, I swear to God, I do not know this man. The third time, the denial came from those who identified his Galilean accent. That's just like it reminded me when we first moved to California and really pleasant interaction. This guy comes to me, we're talking, he's telling us about the city. And he's like, are you from Texas? I guess Texas can't hear their accent. I didn't realize I had an accent. I was like, I am from Texas. So same situation. They heard him talking. They're like, you're a Galilean. I could tell by your accent. You're from over there. And Peter began to curse and swear that he did not know that man. So he goes back into trying to hide who he is with his speech. And he's cussing and he's swearing. It's like, I do not know this man. You know, I've never even been around him. Whatever words or verbiage he's using, he's saying, he's just denying Christ. And then so that man, as he was still speaking, the rooster crowed, and he locked eyes with Jesus and remembered the words and wept, and went out, wept bitterly. And this is in Luke 22, 60 through 62. So if you can just imagine that, they're already at Caiaphas' area, and they're not in a courtyard. They're at his home. Again, very illegal, and it's all hidden under the shroud of darkness. And Peter's there warming up, and these people keep messing with him, and he's changing his verbiage, he's cussing, he's swearing, and he's like, I do not know this man. And by the time he looks over, it had to have been close, because Luke says that he looked at Jesus, and then they heard the rooster crow. And that's when it hit him, the guilt hit him, and he went out weeping bitterly. That is the lesson for today. Next week, we're going to get into the trial with Pilate, the beating, and the crucifixion, Lord willing. Some things I want to look at as a reflection as we just kind of take in what we've just read. Again, just an overview, not a really deep study. The first thing I want to look at or ask is, what is your process when you're struggling with the Father's will? We've seen what Jesus was going through. He was conflicted because of the flesh. The flesh was just kind of shrinking back from the sin and all these things, Satan, you know, but Jesus had the mind of the Father. And he was going to go through regardless, but he had to get his faculties, his emotions to succumb and obedient to the will, and he did. So how do we deal with that? When you're struggling with the Father's will, you know what it is to love your neighbor, and you're just like, I'm not feeling that right now. I cannot love this person right now. You know, I can't. How do we deal with that? Do we get into prayer? Do you fast? Do you seek counsel in His Word? Do you seek counsel with another brother or sister? What is your process when you're struggling with the Father's will? Second one, when struggling with the pressure of life and demands of the job, do you give into depression and the flesh? This was just reminiscent of the disciples sleeping from sorrow, because they were dealing with all these strenuous things that were happening one at a time, just boom, 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 boom. And when they had a chance to sleep, it's like, I just want to sleep. I don't want to think about this stuff no more. You know, how do we deal with that? When you're struggling with the pressures of life and the demands of the job, do you give in to these things? Depression and the flesh. Again, this is what the enemy would have you to do, is just to tap out. Jesus didn't. He kept praying through these things, and then he arose and he went towards the conflict. He confronted it. So that way we do the same thing. When we confront a situation in our life, whether it's a small one or a big one, once we confront it, we have peace of mind. The more we keep fleeing from it, the more we worry about it. So Jesus is showing us to confront these things in our lives. And how do we do it? Do we shriek back, or do we go into depression? Do we just get into our flesh? And the final one is, have you ever denied Jesus? And this doesn't have to be a verbal expression. Titus 1:16 says, they profess to know God, but in their works they deny Him, being an abominable, disobedient, and disqualified for every good work. So you don't only deny Jesus by your words, it could be your actions that are denying that you're a Christian, that you are a follower of Christ. So have you ever denied Jesus in these areas? Not only verbally, but with your actions. And this is something, you know, we deal with ourselves. You can answer inwardly. Because we're called to, just like our brother said this morning, to deny ourselves, shoulder our cross, and follow. But we can deny Him by not denying ourselves, not following through with His commandments to love, not following through with His commandments to do that, the 3 steps. Deny yourself, shoulder your cross, and follow. And then we will now open it up for question, comments, and then we'll get into our prayer time.